Exorcism, the ritual act of driving out demons, has been a cornerstone of Christian belief and practice for centuries. Often shrouded in mystery, fear, and faith, exorcisms are as much a spiritual confrontation as they are a cultural phenomenon. From biblical accounts of Jesus casting out unclean spirits to modern-day rituals performed by Catholic priests, the practice of exorcism continues to inspire intrigue and fear, conjuring images of ancient demons and arcane rites. While the history and practice of exorcism is as much a description of what modern minds might call severe mental illness, some cases are more difficult to explain, with a range of bizarre and frightening paranormal phenomena that defy any rational explanation. In the shadowy corridors of 17th century France, a time steeped in superstition, religious fervor, and fears of witchcraft, the case of Mademoiselle Elisabeth de Renfeng stands out as one of the most chilling accounts of demonic possession ever recorded. Born in 1592 in Lorraine, Elizabeth was the daughter of a well-respected noble family and was admired for her piety, intelligence, and charitable nature. Her devout faith and impeccable reputation seemed to shield her from scandal, yet tragedy struck when her husband, a prominent magistrate, died suddenly, leaving her widowed at a young age. Struggling to maintain her social position while grieving, Elizabeth became vulnerable to sinister forces that would soon overtake her life. What followed were events so terrifying and unexplained that they gripped both the religious authorities and common folk in fear, spreading whispers of witchcraft, curses, and diabolical influence throughout the region. Elizabeth's descent into the realm of the occult began during a time when Europe was gripped by fear of witchcraft, heresy, and diabolical influence. The early 17th century saw an obsession with alchemy and sorcery, practices that blurred the line between science and the supernatural. Alchemists, often viewed as seekers of forbidden knowledge, dabbled in attempts to transform base metals into gold or discover elixirs of immortality. While some were regarded as scholars, others were condemned as charlatans, or worse, as sorcerers, in league with the devil. It was in this climate of suspicion and paranoia that Elizabeth fell under the influence of a shadowy figure, an alleged alchemist and physician, whose intentions were as murky as his practices. This man, whose name has been lost to history, reportedly pursued Elizabeth romantically, but when she rejected his advances, his demeanor darkened. Shortly afterward, Elizabeth began to experience terrifying symptoms that could not be explained by natural causes. Church authorities of the time believed such afflictions were the result of demonic possession, often seen as a consequence of moral or spiritual corruption, or, in Elizabeth's case, as divine punishment for proximity to sorcery. Religious doctrine warned that associating with practitioners of forbidden arts opened spiritual doorways to dark forces, leaving the soul vulnerable to demonic invasion. Elizabeth's afflictions were interpreted as evidence that the devil had taken hold. Her symptoms painted a portrait of possession that closely aligned with the Catholic Church's established criteria. She suffered violent fits, during which her body contorted into grotesque positions, bending joints in ways that defied natural movement, an indication, many believed, of a force beyond human strength manipulating her frame. She spoke in guttural, inhuman voices that seemed to emanate from deep within her, even shifting accents and tones mid-sentence, as though different entities were vying for control. Her eyes, witnesses claimed, rolled back in her head, leaving only the whites visible, a disturbing image associated with demonic manifestations. At times, she was reported to levitate, her body rising off the ground as if defying the laws of nature, an act frequently cited in accounts as proof of supernatural influence. Those present claimed that the voices identified themselves as demons, mocking the priests and reciting their sins with terrifying accuracy. The exorcists noted an overwhelming stench that accompanied the manifestations, a smell they associated with sulfur and decay. Perhaps most unsettling, however, was her sudden ability to speak and understand languages she had never learned, an ability known as xenoglossy. During her fits, Elizabeth allegedly uttered phrases in Latin, Hebrew, and even Aramaic, languages she could not have possibly encountered in her life. Religious authorities considered this phenomenon one of the clearest signs of possession, as it defied rational explanation and hinted at secret, infernal knowledge granted by demonic forces. Her case, therefore, became a focal point for priests and theologians, desperate to reclaim her soul and reaffirm the Church's authority in combating the forces of darkness. Despite the prayers, chants, and holy water, the entity, or entities, within Elizabeth seemed to resist expulsion. It was said that crosses and religious relics burned her skin when they touched her, leaving marks that priests believed were signs of demonic influence. At one point, she allegedly vomited nails and other sharp objects, a phenomenon often cited in possession cases, but rarely witnessed firsthand. As the exorcisms dragged on, the struggle between the forces of light and darkness seemed to consume Elizabeth entirely. After prolonged efforts, Elizabeth was declared free of the demonic forces, though some accounts suggest that her recovery was gradual and incomplete. Yet what makes her story even more enigmatic is what followed. Rather than retreating from the public eye, Elizabeth went on to establish a religious order, dedicating herself to helping lost women find redemption. But whispers lingered. Some believed Elizabeth's transformation was divine intervention, while others speculated that the darkness had never truly left her, merely lying dormant beneath the surface. To this day, her case remains an unsettling reminder of the thin veil that separates the natural from the supernatural and the mysteries that refuse to be explained. The case of George Lukens, also known as the Yatton demoniac, is one of the most well-known accounts of alleged demonic possession in 18th century England. It unfolded in the small village of Yatton, Somerset, and captured widespread attention due to its eerie details and dramatic exorcism. In the 18th century, England was steeped in religious tension. While the Church of England maintained authority, the rise of Methodism reignited belief in miracles, demons, and divine intervention. Despite growing skepticism, rural communities clung to folk traditions, fearing witchcraft, curses, and demonic possession. Science offered fledgling explanations for mental illness, but many still saw fits and strange voices as evidence of spiritual torment. George Lukens was a tailor who had lived an ordinary life until he began exhibiting disturbing behavior in 1778. Described as a pious man before his affliction, Lukens suddenly started experiencing violent fits, speaking in strange voices, and singing hymns in reverse, an act that many believed mocked Christianity. He claimed to be possessed by 7 demons, a number deeply symbolic in Christian tradition, representing spiritual completeness or total domination by evil forces. This symbolism echoes the biblical account of Mary Magdalene, who was said to have been freed from 7 demons by Jesus. Lukens reportedly referred to his tormentors as infernal spirits who mocked Christ and the Holy Trinity, though specific names of the demons were never formally documented in contemporary accounts. During his episodes, witnesses described Lukens as speaking with multiple voices, each with distinct tones and personalities, as though different entities were vying for control. Some voices were said to blaspheme God, recite prayers backward, and challenge the authority of the priests attempting to intervene. Lukens also demonstrated unnatural strength during his fits, thrashing violently and resisting attempts to subdue him. even when restrained by several men. He is said to have spoken in Latin and Greek, languages he had no known knowledge of, and at times produced sounds described as guttural growls, howls, and inhuman cries. Such displays aligned with traditional signs of possession, as outlined by Catholic and Anglican teachings, reinforcing fears that Lucan's affliction was not of this world, but the result of direct demonic influence. Physicians and medical practitioners of the time examined him, but none could identify a physical cause for his condition. As medical science failed to explain or cure him, Lucan's was declared to be suffering from demonic possession rather than a physical or mental illness. His case drew attention from religious leaders who viewed it as a spiritual crisis, requiring divine intervention. The exorcism of George Lucan's, conducted on Friday, June 13, 1788, in the vestry room of Temple Church in Bristol, was a meticulously planned ritual led by Reverend Joseph Easterbrook and 6 Methodist ministers. The number of clergymen, 7, was symbolically chosen to counteract the 7 demons Lucan's claimed were possessing him, mirroring the biblical account of Mary Magdalene's deliverance from 7 demons. The ceremony commenced with the singing of hymns and fervent prayers, invoking divine intervention. As the ministers intensified their supplications, Lucan's demeanor shifted dramatically. He began to exhibit violent convulsions, his body contorting unnaturally. Witnesses reported that he spoke in multiple distinct voices, some of which blasphemed and mocked the clergy, while others emitted guttural, animalistic sounds, including barking noises. At one point, he purportedly sang an inverted version of the Te Deum, a traditional Christian hymn, which was perceived as a direct affront to the sanctity of the ritual. Throughout the ordeal, the clergymen maintained their resolve, invoking the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit to command the departure of the evil spirits. The confrontation reached a climax when a voice from Lucan's reportedly questioned, "Must I give up my power?" Following this, Lucan's let out a series of dreadful howls before collapsing into a state of calm. In his natural voice, he then exclaimed, "Blessed Jesus!" He proceeded to recite the Lord's Prayer and expressed profound gratitude to the assembled ministers for his deliverance. The aftermath of the exorcism was marked by a notable transformation in Lucan's behavior. He was described as serene and composed, with no recurrence of the previous violent fits or blasphemous outbursts. This apparent recovery reinforced the belief among many contemporaries that the exorcism had successfully expelled the demonic entities. However, skepticism persisted, with some medical professionals of the era attributing his symptoms to conditions such as epilepsy, and others accusing Lucan's of imposture. Despite the controversies, the exorcism of George Lucan's remains a significant historical example of 18th century beliefs in demonic possession and the practices employed to confront perceived manifestations of the supernatural. The case of Clara Germana Cell is one of the most unsettling and widely discussed accounts of alleged demonic possession in the 20th century. It took place in South Africa in 1906, involving a 16-year-old girl who was attending a religious school. Her story is particularly eerie due to the vivid and terrifying details reported by witnesses. Clara Germana Kelly was an orphan and a devout Catholic who had been raised in a Christian environment at the mission. Her upbringing reflected the deeply religious atmosphere of early 20th century South Africa, where Catholic missionaries sought to instill strict moral teachings and obedience to faith. At the time, Christian doctrine emphasized the ever-present struggle between divine forces and the powers of darkness, reinforcing fears of Satan's influence over vulnerable souls. This worldview was influenced by centuries of Christian teaching on possession, dating back to the New Testament, where Jesus expelled demons as a demonstration of divine authority. Such stories shaped the Church's understanding of spiritual warfare, leading to a firm belief that demonic forces could target individuals, particularly those perceived as spiritually compromised. Despite her religious upbringing, it was later claimed that Clara had secretly made a pact with Satan, possibly out of curiosity, rebellion, or desperation. The idea of pacts with the devil was rooted in European folklore and Catholic tradition, fueled by the witch trials and demonology texts of the 15th and 16th centuries. Even as these beliefs evolved into the modern era, the Catholic Church retained its stance that spiritual vulnerability, especially among the emotionally distressed or socially isolated, could attract malevolent forces. According to accounts, Clara herself confessed to this pact during her possession, sparking fear that she had willingly opened herself to demonic forces. Such confessions were not uncommon during exorcisms, as the possessed often vocalized guilt, shame, or blasphemous thoughts that mirrored the Church's teachings on sin and damnation. The mere suggestion of a pact reinforced the belief that Clara's affliction was not a natural disorder, but a spiritual invasion requiring divine intervention. Clara's initial symptoms were subtle but unsettling. Teachers and nuns at St. Michael's Mission began to notice changes in her behavior. Once quiet and obedient, she became increasingly agitated and defiant, exhibiting sudden outbursts of anger and hostility. She was observed murmuring to herself in tones that seemed unnatural and fragmented, sometimes laughing uncontrollably for no apparent reason. These signs were initially dismissed as emotional distress or rebellious behavior, perhaps fueled by adolescence or struggles with identity and grief from being orphaned. However, Clara's behavior soon escalated into something far more sinister, forcing those around her to reconsider natural explanations. Later, Clara's body began to betray signs of what observers described as inhuman possession. She displayed superhuman strength, often requiring several adults to restrain her during violent outbursts. Nuns reported that she could throw people across rooms and bend her limbs in unnatural ways without showing signs of pain or injury. Her physical appearance also underwent subtle but alarming changes. Witnesses claimed her eyes would turn glassy and roll back into her head during fits, while her facial expressions contorted into grotesque grimaces. At times, her body reportedly became rigid and unmovable, as though paralyzed, only to convulse moments later in terrifying spasms. Adding to these physical symptoms, Clara's reaction to religious symbols soon convinced the clergy that her condition was spiritual rather than psychological. She exhibited a violent aversion to crucifixes, holy water, and prayers. Whenever a cross was brought near her, she reportedly shrieked and hissed, often cursing in languages she had never studied. Holy water burned her skin, leaving red welts that looked like burns or scratches, and she would react with animal-like snarls if it touched her. During Mass, she mocked the liturgy and was said to disrupt prayers by laughing and howling. Witnesses described these reactions as uncontrollable and beyond human reasoning, deepening fears that she was under the influence of malevolent forces. Perhaps the most inexplicable symptom was Clara's ability to speak languages she had never learned, a phenomenon known as xenoglossy. Though she had received limited education, Clara was heard speaking Latin, French, and German, often quoting scripture backward or reciting blasphemous variations of prayers. In addition to languages, she displayed a supernatural awareness of hidden details about the lives of those around her. Priests and nuns were horrified when Clara began revealing their private sins, fears, and weaknesses, secrets that could not have been known to her through ordinary means. These revelations were interpreted as evidence of demonic knowledge intended to humiliate and undermine the faith of those performing the exorcism. Clara's actions became increasingly feral and animalistic. She would growl, hiss, and bark like a dog, sometimes mimicking the roar of a lion with a volume and resonance that seemed impossible for a teenage girl. She was seen crawling on all fours, snapping her teeth like a wild animal, and emitting guttural cries that sent chills through witnesses. Her movements also defied natural physics. Clara reportedly climbed walls with unnatural agility, even scaling vertical surfaces as though gravity had no hold on her. On at least one occasion, she was said to have levitated several feet off the ground, defying the laws of nature in a manner consistent with documented cases of possession. The mission also experienced paranormal disturbances surrounding Clara. Objects reportedly moved on their own, doors slammed shut, and sudden gusts of wind swept through rooms without explanation. Clara's voice sometimes echoed unnaturally, as if layered with multiple tones, leading witnesses to believe that more than one entity had taken control of her. Clara's physical body also began to bear signs of possession. Scratches, bruises, and bite marks appeared on her skin overnight, often forming symbols or patterns associated with the occult. She was seen vomiting nails and shards of glass, phenomena reported in other exorcisms as signs of supernatural interference. The mission's leaders could no longer ignore the possibility that she was possessed by a demonic force. Her confession of making a pact with Satan added weight to the fears, and after medical interventions failed, the decision was made to conduct an exorcism in accordance with the Rituale Romanum. Clara's symptoms leading up to the ritual painted a harrowing portrait of possession, a case so extreme and well documented that it continues to provoke debates about the line between mental illness and the supernatural. With her life spiraling out of control, Clara became the focus of one of the most terrifying spiritual battles ever recorded. The exorcism began in a dimly lit room at St. Michael's Mission. The air was heavy, thick with an almost palpable tension, as the priests gathered their crucifixes, holy water, and prayer books. The room itself seemed to shudder under the weight of unseen forces, with faint whispers and scratches echoing through the walls, even before the ritual began. Clara was restrained, her wild thrashing and growling making it impossible to proceed without physical intervention. Her eyes glowed unnaturally, reflecting the candlelight in a way that made her seem not entirely human. As the priests opened their prayer books and began the Rituale Romanum, Clara let out a piercing scream so loud that it echoed through the halls of the mission, forcing several nuns to flee in terror. As the prayers intensified, so did Clara's resistance. She spat at the priests, cursed God, and mocked the Holy Scriptures being read aloud. Her voice shifted without warning, alternating between a deep, guttural growl and a shrill, high-pitched wail, often speaking in multiple voices simultaneously. Those present described it as though several entities were speaking through her at once, overlapping and arguing with each other in a chaotic symphony of blasphemy and rage. At one point, Clara reportedly broke free from her restraints, throwing several people to the ground with strength that far exceeded her small frame. The priests struggled to regain control as she lunged at them, attempting to claw their faces and tear their vestments. One priest later described the sensation of being pinned by an unseen force when Clara glared directly at him, her eyes burning with what he could only describe as hatred beyond human comprehension. The most terrifying moments came when Clara's body began to defy the laws of nature. Witnesses reported that she levitated several feet off the ground, her body arching unnaturally as though an invisible force was holding her up. She hovered above the floor for several moments before crashing down, her howls echoing like an animal caught in a trap. Clara also demonstrated the ability to scale walls, her body contorting and twisting as she climbed upward like a spider, leaving even the most experienced priests momentarily frozen in fear. The The movements were so rapid and unnatural that many described them as inhuman, further cementing the belief that she was being puppeted by demonic forces. Throughout the exorcism, objects in the room trembled and moved without being touched. Candles flickered and went out, leaving the priests momentarily in darkness, while furniture creaked as though something invisible was pressing against it. Several times, the priests reported hearing disembodied voices, whispering blasphemies, taunts, and mocking laughter that did not seem to come from Clara herself. Clara also displayed bizarre physical symptoms, vomiting black bile, nails, and shards of glass, objects she could not have ingested naturally. These horrifying manifestations were seen as signs that the demons within her were resisting expulsion, using every weapon at their disposal to weaken the faith of those attempting to drive them out. As the exorcism neared its climax, Clara's screams grew more desperate, and her voice, once mocking, shifted to pleading and shrieking. The priest pressed on, chanting prayers and invoking the name of Christ to command the spirits to leave. Clara's body convulsed violently, and her voice alternated between roaring curses and wailing cries for mercy. Suddenly, Clara collapsed, her body falling limp. A shadow seemed to pass across her face, and she let out one final, blood-curdling scream before falling silent. For several moments, the room was gripped by an eerie stillness, broken only by Clara's soft, trembling voice as she whispered the Lord's Prayer and declared herself free. The priests, shaken but victorious, declared the exorcism a success, though many remained haunted by what they had witnessed. Clara reportedly returned to a calm and normal state following the ritual, but the scars, both physical and emotional, lingered. Nuns who had witnessed the exorcism described the experience as one of pure evil, a battle they hoped never to face again. Yet questions remained. Was Clara truly possessed? Or was her ordeal the result of psychological distress, trauma, or repressed guilt? Skeptics would later suggest mental illness or hysteria, but for those who saw her levitate, vomit unnatural objects, and speak in tongues, there was no doubt. Clara Germana Sale had been touched by dark forces beyond human comprehension. The phenomenon of exorcism remains one of the most chilling rituals in human history, a confrontation between the sacred and the profane, where faith collides with forces that defy reason. It is a rite born out of desperation, a final resort when medicine and logic fail to explain the unexplainable. In dimly lit rooms and candlelit chapels, the words of ancient prayers echo against walls trembling with unseen pressure, while the possessed writhe and howl, their voices twisting into unnatural tones that seem to come from somewhere beyond the human soul. Witnesses describe levitations, guttural growls, and whispered secrets that no mortal should know, leaving them haunted long after the ritual has ended. Whether one views exorcism as an act of spiritual warfare or as a manifestation of mental illness and mass hysteria, its impact is undeniable. The accounts linger like shadows, hinting at the unknown forces that might dwell just beyond the veil of our understanding. Cases like those of Mademoiselle de Renfeng, Clara Germana, and George Lukens evoke ancient fears. The terror that something unspeakable could slip into the world, wearing human skin, and that its grip might only be broken through the raw power of faith. In the end, exorcisms remind us of the fragility of the human spirit, the limits of reason, and the dark mysteries that refuse to be tamed by the modern world.